Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Anne Morgan, and today we're going to be talking about a subject that strikes fear into the heart of many. It can make us feel uncomfortable, emotional, anxious, and that subject is money. But fear not, because help is on its way, and we are delighted to be joined by Andrea Kennedy, who is a money expert, and she's helped hundreds of people get a better understanding of their relationship with money. It's complicated, but she can work it out. And Andrea, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, delighted that you're here.
You.
And can we start by asking you a little bit about your early life and when did you first start having a relationship with money?
So this is a great question. It's actually something everybody should ask themselves because it will lead you to a lot of answers. Some might be positive, some might be negative or not so positive. But my relationship with money, of course, it comes from our parents, right? And I had parents. So I think if we look into our parents and their relationship with money, you'll start to understand your own. You know, I had a father who grew up during the Depression in the U.S. And so he knew how to save. He knew how to earn. You know,
Sure.
He was anxious about money, maybe more anxious than would be fantastic or ideal. But that's a very common experience. If you've come out of a war, out of a depression, you're going to have a parent who's very aware of the value of money. They're not going to waste it on frivolous things and so on. On the other hand, I had a mother who grew up somewhat after the war in somewhat more comfortable times. And so she understood that it wasn't enough to save money, that you actually had to also invest money. And so she was the investor in the family. So in the 50s and 60s, there weren't that many women who were comfortable investing money. And my mother really figured this out on her own. She was really self-taught. So I grew up in what I came to understand later was a very unusual household. You know, I learned from my father I had to earn money. So he had chores, and we got money for those chores. So earning, I didn't just get money. A lot of kids these days, they just get money just because they're getting an allowance and they don't have to do anything. I really remember earning every dollar and saving every dollar. And then on the second piece, the investing, I remember my mother like yelling at her stockbroker. You know, she was telling him, like, don't sell me that crap. Like, don't call me again. She was really asserting herself. And I really have that distinct memory of her asserting herself with her stockbroker, who I will add, she had her whole life. So they developed a working relationship, but he knew not to call her up and just sell her whatever, Merrill Lynch wanted to sell at that time. So, I had a very unusual early experience with money because of these parental influences.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I have to say, my parents grew up at a similar time to your parents, but they were ultra conservative. You know, they emigrated from Ireland to England, and my mother was in charge of finances, actually, but it was very conservative. But I just remember the first dollar I ever earned, it was the hardest one. I tell you, that pound, I had to deliver 100 free newspapers to get hold of that first money that I actually earned for myself, and I've still got it.
That's what I mean. That's really, it's actually positive because I think you've worked a lot of your life too, so that you made that early connection between I need to work to get money, and I know my parents are saving, so I'm guessing also that saving came relatively comfortably.
Yes,
for you, right?
Absolutely. And it was that feeling that you just know the value and try and save a little bit.
Right.
And that was something that was absolutely drilled into both of us. Now, where we differed a little bit, my mother always drove a hard bargain. And I find that very hard to do. And she's absolutely disgusted that I don't, that I just accept the price of things and don't barter or don't make more of an effort to get a bargain, because she's an absolute class A bargain hunter, I have to say.
But I think parents also have to understand that you can be conservative with money and you can drive a hard bargain, but you can also have a generous heart. In other ways, you can be generous with time. You can be generous with, helping neighbors. You can be generous in other ways. And so even if you don't have a lot of excess money, there's other ways to be generous towards people. And we also have to be generous towards ourselves and, take rest when we need it and take walks when we need it. So I think that that's okay to grow up in a family. I remember my father, despite, essentially being really conservative with money, my memory of him is as a generous man. because he was always playing with us after school. He didn't, I think, concern us with what his money worries, so he always had time for us. So I also think of him as a generous person, even though when I think about it, probably financially, he was not, throwing money around, right?
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. I mean, both my parents were exceptionally generous, even though they didn't have a great deal of money. But they did make time to make sure they were as that we were all as secure as possible,
right.
Financially, even if they weren't sophisticated in the way that they dealt with money. It was very much. I'm always fascinated in that families, have, deal with stocks and shares, and especially in that era. In the UK, it was very much you put money in the building society,
right.
And of course there was an interest rate in
right.
those days, so
right,
you actually
exactly.
did get some compound interest. But that was really as sophisticated as people got with investments, and I think where I find things very confusing is there just seems so many avenues now.
Right. So kind of two things have happened, kind of one good and one bad, if you will. And this parlays into psychology, which is really my second focus of both education and how I help clients is financial psychology. So the two things that have happened is that investing has gotten much easier, particularly in financial markets. So we're not talking about buying real assets, homes and all that. That's always been there. But investing in financial markets has never been easier. It's never been cheaper, right? There's never been a more efficient way to invest than there is now. So that's fantastic. And that's because of passive indexing and using exchange traded funds. So you can literally just open an account here locally and begin to invest tomorrow. And it's inexpensive. There's also robo-advisors. The downside is now that there's so many more options. I mean, just like the grocery store, right? There only used to be 3 jars of pickles, and now there's like 400, right? So the same thing's happened with investing. And then you get this kind of analysis or paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
So people end up doing nothing, which is actually the worst.
Well, they just become like rabbits in headlamps.
Right.
Because
and
it is.
If you're unfamiliar with it and you haven't grown up with the language in your household and learning how to speak this language, then you will feel anxious and you will never feel like you're doing the right thing. And I can tell you, even as an investor and as someone who invests other people's money, I keep pretty focused on, I don't invest in thousands of things. I really focus on the investments I know that, are the most efficient investments and, have the best track records and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's important that people not try to do too much, that people learn in steps, but that you do start. Yeah, you do start putting money away, whether it's for a retirement portfolio or for, some kind of long-term investment portfolio.
Yes, and start early, would you say?
The earlier, my kids have already started.
Yeah.
So the earlier, the better, because then you get used to, markets go through cycles. And occasionally we have a big crash like we had in 2008 and 2009. But the more you get emotionally accustomed to seeing your investments go up and down, the more it's going to be like, oh yeah, this is normal. And the truth is we shouldn't be looking at our money all the time. We should just put a system in place that allows us to invest consistently and regularly. And yes, if you start young, then you're not catching up when you're 50 or 45 and panicking because, oh my God, you don't have enough money, which is what a lot of people do. They don't start young. They go and they spend all of their money, on whatever. And it's fine to travel. Like I was young. That's how I spent my money, but that was my indulgence. I didn't spend it on everything. It was travel for me. Other people spend it on shopping. Other people spend it on, eating. Other people, drinking. It doesn't matter as long as you're saving something is the point, right? And investing it.
Yeah. So even though, you didn't have very much money when you were young and, you were traveling and things like that, you still had that system in place. Yeah. And you think that is the way forward for everybody?
I think if you just start young, and again, this goes to habits, which is something I know that you're really familiar with. It's about forming a habit. And the habit is not, I'm going to spend all my money. The habit is, I'm going to get my paycheck. I'm going to set aside, let's say 10, 15% of it, and that is going to consistently go into an investment portfolio. Maybe a portion of that will go towards saving for a down payment for a home. But that money every month is going to do, if you will, the same thing, and I'm not going to have access to it. Okay, so now I've got less money, and now I've got to make choices. Right? And so then that becomes your habit. Well, what do you choose to spend money on? How do you choose? And people get really wrapped up in like what millennials are spending their money on and what people have always spent their money on stupid things. Like millennials are just like every other generation. In some ways, they're much more aware because I think they have less. They've got more student debt and so on. But the truth is, it's not what you're spending your money on. It's why you're spending your money. And a lot of people spend money for social belonging, and that's fine. But, there's sometimes ways to get our why other than spending money to get our why. So why are we spending money is something that people should all do some self-reflection on.
Yes, that is a very interesting question.
For expats,
for
I think,
expats.
particularly because you're uprooted, you're in a new place, and you want to belong.
Yeah.
And that's a mammal thing. That's not even a human thing.
Yeah.
That is, we all want to belong. So how do we belong in a way that doesn't bankrupt us?
Absolutely. I mean, I personally, my relationship with money changed enormously when I became an expat. And I was fairly typical in that I followed my partner to Singapore, and I went from being somebody who earned a salary every month. I bought my own apartment. I was very financially independent. And then suddenly I went on the expat journey, and I became what was known as a trailing spouse,
which is an awful,
an
awful terminology.
Term. and I couldn't even open a bank account.
Yeah.
So I did have it was a very difficult transition. But to your point, I did want to belong. And so there's two things happening. There was this massive change with my relationship with money. And then there was this pressure to find something else and develop a new bridge, really, between the old and the new life. And that includes a money bridge as well. So
that's a very good way of putting it, is a money bridge.
Yeah.
But for you, you did go and work.
I did.
Right.
I did. And that was my saviour, actually. And I didn't earn the money that I earned before, but that was really immaterial. It was, I had some money. I could buy my things out of my money, and I could put them back in, put money into the family finances. And I felt it didn't matter really the amount.
The proportion. The proportion didn't matter.
Yeah.
As long as, so I think it sounds like you have a very kind of transparent money relationship. So I think when you're in the position of following someone overseas, I always tell people, and I think people tend to not think about this until it's too late, but really get good with your money before you come overseas, right? And understand your money and have good communication. And I think if people can communicate, have transparency, and have systems, it sounds like your family did, before you came overseas, then it's actually easier to transition and not do wrong by your money once you get overseas. It's when those pieces aren't in place that people end up having money. And then in some cases, you were fortunate you could work. Not everyone's in the position. They've got young kids or whatever. And they do feel a real shift of power away from them in terms of who gets to say over what. So I always tell women to stay involved in the conversation, even if they're not earning money. They still have to retire with their husband. It's still the household money. So you should always remain involved in the conversation. So I'm guessing you still are involved in the conversation.
I am.
Very good.
I am involved in the conversation, but could do better.
Okay.
So I think, that's a memo to self. It's take more responsibility, and not and I think that's a personal thing. You can't expect somebody else to sort it out for you. You have to, and it can be a little bit daunting,
yep,
and confusing. But when you break it down and communicate, as you said, I know it's a thread running through a lot of what you've just said, Andrea. It's the communication between partners and the transparency. So at least if you know what's there and what's going on, and nothing's being hidden from either party,
right,
then it's just healthier.
And I think when I see problems developing overseas, I sometimes think that there was probably fissures before they got overseas. But what you end up seeing is, how we spend money is what we value. Right?
Right.
I buy equity, so I value investing. but other people just will want to shop or will want to travel or will want to go out with their friends and drink all night. So again, it's not my role ever to say how a person should or should not be spending their money, but it is a reflection of their values. And so what kind of can get laid bare is that you're realizing your partner may not have the same values as you, right? And then the repair has to be, how do you bring it back together, where you each get a bit of what you want, but you then also share some kind of same value structure around money.
Yeah.
And if you can't, it is hard. It's very hard. It doesn't matter how much money you're making, how little you're making. It's about what you value and what you're choosing to spend money on together and how you're choosing to invest together.
Yeah.
And that's all communications at the heart of that, right?
It is. It's communication and attitude.
Yeah.
And
perspective and keeping perspective. And it's easy to lose perspective overseas. And I think also people don't realize, a lot of what you see is not necessarily what is. I've known people living in very big houses who don't have enough money at the end of the month, right? But they really want to have that big home, either for whatever reason, set aside what the reasons are. And, they could downgrade, they could have more money, but they're not for some reason, right? So there's also a lot of what you see, particularly as an expatriate. Everyone's come from somewhere else. Everyone's got a story or two or three. You're not quite sure what's real sometimes, and a lot of it's not real.
I think that's a fascinating insight, actually, that what you see on the surface and the pressure that people put themselves under to project, maybe it's a projection of security or it's projection of worth, and they totally overextend themselves in an area that, I think with expat life, nothing is secure forever. And, people don't have enough contingency maybe, or they feel they have to live this very expensive lifestyle.
Well, I think I've always said, becoming an expat is kind of like going back to high school. All of a sudden, everyone's new. You're trying to figure out who do you belong to, and, you can end up spending a lot of money to be with people who spend a lot of money. That doesn't mean anybody actually has a lot of money. So it does become this very strange thing. And, I've been an expat for 30 years. So I've really seen people from my 20s, how things have turned out in their 50s. A stunning number of people actually are having financial problems in their 50s because of what they were doing in their 20s, right? And that's not to say you shouldn't be out having fun or spending time or traveling. The whole point of being overseas is to experience life. But you have to give yourself natural limits, based on the income you're bringing in, right? You can still do a lot of these things and, still save money or invest money.
Well, it comes back to your system, doesn't it, that you mentioned at the beginning. If you establish that as the cornerstone of what of your financial security and keep up that regular habit, then it will be there in your 20s, in your 30s, and then 50s and 60s and into retirement.
And the punchline of that, you'll end up being friends with who do the same thing. You won't end up having really close friends who don't care about those things. You'll end up actually being friends with people who are basically financially responsible, right? Because like ultimately attracts like. And so as your net worth grows and as you have more, you're going to end up being around people who naturally have what you have, right? So you're not going to be playing catch up. You're not going to be pretending with credit cards. So you naturally are going to gravitate towards people who also have really healthy financial habits.
It's interesting that so and sometimes that correlation, people can have, can be incredibly careful with money, even though they've got a huge amount of money. They do know the value of it. It works both ways, doesn't it?
So my client range goes from people really just starting out to people who have $10-20 million, and the people who have the most money absolutely are conscious of how their money is spent. And sometimes this is inherited, so they've learned from their parents and over generations and so on. But a lot of it is made recently, and they are very conscious. I would say the people who are least kind of aware of their money are in an industry or in a business where it is big money. It's big money over a short period of time. It comes fast, it goes fast. It's kind of like a lottery winning feeling. Those people, I think, have less control over their money. Sometimes, or they've grown up in one lifestyle. They never learned about money. I get a lot of this too. I would say kids who are now adults that were expats when they were young, who've come back to Singapore, their parents had a certain lifestyle. They expect to have exactly the same lifestyle, but things change, they can't necessarily make the same amount of money their parents did. Singapore has become much more expensive. So you also see people falling into this, my parents had it trapped, and they don't have the same luxuries. They don't have the same, income. The Singapore is more expensive, so they can't have the same things. That becomes a perception issue, right?
Yeah, and perception between the generations is a tough one, isn't it? Yes. If you think that, the generation coming up now may be the first generation that don't have as much as their parents. That's a tough one to manage money-wise.
Yes, and they didn't go through some hardship, a lot of them. They didn't go through a war. They didn't go through a whatever. So they don't have the discipline of that, if you will, that hardship, and yet they don't necessarily have the same income, or they've got more debt. And certainly if there's any Americans out there, student debt in America is just a huge thing. It's becoming a thing in other countries. So they have more debt. They have somewhat less discipline. Right. And so, I think the sooner a family can start their kids down the road of just, you've got to earn money, you've got to understand why you're spending your money. If all your friends are just out spending money and they can spend endless amounts of money and you can't, well, that's going to be hard at some point, right? It doesn't get easier as you get older. So it's all that understanding your why and understanding to start early and developing habits early is really important. And it's hard as kids are kind of developing and, just as they're going from their teens into their 20s. But my kids were able to do it, because I kind of made them do it.
Yes.
I didn't give them an endless amount of money. If their friends had new things, I was like, good for your friends, but that doesn't mean we get, we have to have new things. And you just make it a regular part of the conversation too. You don't make it weird to talk about money. Yeah. Then it's easier over the long term.
Yeah. And I think it's for me, and we've talked about this at the beginning, it was getting used to working long hours especially working really hard to get the benefits later. So it's this delayed gratification.
Yes, it's the ultimate. Yeah. So and that's hard now. And there's a lot that feels like it's immediate gratification, and social media doesn't help this and all that. But there's, instant gratification's always been a problem. Now it's maybe just exacerbated because of social media. It's literally putting limits around kids. Like, this is your allowance. This is what you get. If you blow through it, there's no more. And having the kids suffer a little bit, I think parents don't want to do this. They want their kids to have everything. They want their kids to keep up with the kids at school who are drinking Cristal at, Marina Bay Sands and stuff. I mean, it's crazy. I'm like, you go spend your money on that. I'm not going to give you money to keep up with, people running around doing this kind of stuff. So, you just have to establish it earlier. And interestingly, my kids have had friends who've had, the whole spectrum of socioeconomic friendships, right? From kids that are on tight budgets to parents who have tremendous wealth, but they share the same values. Right? So that's what you end up getting as a kid who has some values by the end of this, right? Yeah. And then they're off to college and they already have the right habits and they understand money. Yeah, and they understand they shouldn't be spending money just crazy. They should be studying.
Yeah, so there you go. That's a phenomenal lesson, isn't it? Your values and your habits are separate to the amount of money that you're ever going to earn. So if you establish where your values are and you develop the right habits, then you're going to end up with, a more secure
That's
future.
Right. And a better way to think about things. And you'll probably end up being more self-reflective because you're forced to be self-reflective, right? If you can't have everything, you've got to think about what you want. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of small good things we can do as parents that aren't, big dramatic money moments, that are just small little habits that accumulate over time.
Great. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the financial services industry. And I think that frightens a lot of people because it can be quite aggressive sales-wise. What's your take on that?
So first thing first, financial services is the only thing that we buy that we really don't understand the cost of. And that is amazing to me. You go into the grocery store, you know what you're paying for things. Like, everyone looks at the labels, except when it comes to financial services. And part of this is that we sometimes get intimidated into not asking the right questions. So there's a few tips. First, I'm just going to give you a scenario. This is a very typical scenario. If you invest $100,000 and you pay 1%, and you invest $100,000, a different person pays 3%. 30 years later, if with the same return of 8% return per year, one person will have $725,000, the other will have $400,000. Category, the 3% is what a lot of people pay in a place like Singapore, and you have to be aware of it. So I think there's a few issues when you're engaging the financial services industry. And the first would be that you actually have to find somebody that you're comfortable with, that you don't feel like is just a sales job. This is a journey, and you should be having a journey with this person, right? It shouldn't just be like a one-off sales. Your money gets put in some closet and you don't ever see it again or somewhere, but you're paying into something somewhere, right? That you have transparency, that you understand what you're investing in, and that this person takes the time to explain it to you. And if you're intimidated and the person's not making you feel better, they should be able to explain it like you're 3 years old, just the way I did, right? And they should be able to explain your investments like that. And their fees should be transparent. If you're talking to somebody and they're telling you one thing one day, so you have to understand all the layers of fees, and there's usually 3 or 4 layers of fees. Again, it depends on what you're investing in. I won't get into belabor the details, but you have to understand that all of those fees are coming out of your money, and they're being drained out, whether transparently or not. So those are the pieces that you really have. So find someone you can talk to, find someone who's transparent, and find someone who's literally willing to say, it's this total amount, and then you know. And again, I think a lot of it is there's a million people who want to invest your money in Singapore. Like, there's an endless buffet of just find someone that you can have a conversation with. And it should be easy, and it should be calming, and it should not feel like a sales job. The other thing I've seen is that sometimes men don't want the woman brought into the conversation. That is a problem.
Yeah.
It should be both of you in there, and you should both be equally comfortable. It shouldn't be this advisor taking this guy out for a drink, convincing him to invest in X. I've seen divorces over that. So these are some really basic things that everyone can do. And again, I think it's finding the right person, right? And that this is going to be a journey, not a one-off, and then you're never going to see the person again.
I mean, it
transaction,
does, yeah, it does involve, it's the trust factor. Yep. And getting beyond, we talked about it being overwhelming choice-wise. So it really is,
So I think people should read. I mean, I've written a book, but there's a lot of good, simple books about investing. So I've written Own Your Financial Freedom. Andrew Hallam's written Millionaire Teacher. He's a friend. There's a lot of good, simple books. So just pick up a book. That's a really good place to start. If somebody veers way off the advice in those books, you have to ask why, right? Yeah. We're all saying the same thing. So we're all advocates for financial education, really.
Yeah.
So why would somebody try to sell you something different, right?
Right. And I love that. I mean, for us, it was very much it was an education. And, we were not young, but we felt like children when it came to that whole investment portion of our lives. And what did help enormously was reading those simple books and educating ourselves so that we did have a bigger part in the conversation and a better understanding of things like fee structures and what difference that's going to make at the end of the day.
My mother didn't teach me how to cook. She taught me how to invest, right? So how people feel about investing, I feel about being in the kitchen. But I've learned over time, and I've learned by making mistakes, and I've made small mistakes, not big mistakes. And you will make mistakes in investing. It's not always going to go perfectly or right. But it's just about starting down the road, right? I mean, it's like, can I scramble an egg? Okay, got it. Onto something bigger than that. And investing is kind of the same way. And I think the younger you start and the more kind of ups and downs of markets you go through, then the whole thing just becomes, you kind of see what happens and you become less stressed out by it all. The other thing I'd like to just add, just because I know we're talking expatriates, is to always have a will and an up-to-date will, and always make sure you have enough life insurance, because those things are just pieces that people, for some reason, they're really obvious pieces of estate planning, and people really also need to have those in place, particularly if you have minor children.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. Now, I grew up, my mother used to work in probate.
Oh, really?
In the civil service.
You've seen it firsthand.
Obsessed with wills.
Yes, of course. That's actually a good thing to be obsessed with. Yeah. And this is inexpensive. Like, you can go to Simply Wills here. It's $300. It's like you can actually not even go to you can just sign a will and have 2 witnesses. So it's easy to get it put in order. And so and then just having enough life insurance. I think not enough people think about this too. So having those kind of pieces really save a lot of families from heartache, in the worst times.
Okay. That is superb advice, I would say. So just to wrap up our conversation, a little bit about if somebody is very overwhelmed with where they are financially and just feeling they're sticking their head in the sand and they're just feeling pretty hopeless, what are the simple steps that they can take?
Right. So I would say the first thing is not got to do with money. I would say find out why you're sticking your head in the sand, right? And get into that a little bit, and you can do that through self-reflection. You can talk to a therapist. I'm a financial coach. You can talk to me, but I would say get to kind of the root of that, because that's not going to go away, even if you start taking the right steps. Once you kind of understand, maybe it's just that you're unfamiliar with it. Maybe you have an attention thing. Maybe somebody's not made you feel good in your past. So it's important to understand why that is happening. And then you can first start by looking at how much you're saving. Are you saving anywhere between 10 to 25%? If so, then that's good. You've got that money saved. Okay, then the next step is, are you investing that money, right? Because this is how we ultimately grow our net worth, right? Which is what we own versus what we owe. And we want to be able to grow that every year, right? And that comes from savings, paying down debt, and investing. So we're savings. If we don't have debt, hopefully, or we're paying it down consistently, great. If you're not, then tackle the debt. And if you have real debt issues, there's ways to get debt counseling. So you can really go to counselors here and get debt counseling. And I suggest tackling the debt before you go down the road to investing, because investing is a long-term thing. You don't want to be buying and selling every day. You invest your money, you leave it alone. So you want to make sure that that's money that you can put aside for a long period of time. So I would say first look at your savings, make sure your debt's being paid down. Just tackle those two. And honestly, that's like a huge amount for a lot of people. Then the third is getting comfortable with long-term investing. And you can open up a bank account and invest tomorrow if you want. It's a very simple process to get your money invested, but you have to be doing it for the long term. Yeah?
Well, great advice, and thank you, Andrea. Where can people find you?
You can find me at wiserwealth.net. You can email me, Andrea, at wiserwealth.net. I live in Singapore. I'm traveling to China a lot because my book has just been being translated and being distributed in China, so I'll be in and out. And I have clients all over the region. But yeah, just get a hold of me through my website. And if you want to have a conversation or have a coffee, I'm happy. I'm happy to meet up with anybody of any level of net worth. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You know, it's always an interesting conversation to talk about money.
Oh, that's a lovely place to end. Thank you for joining us today, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you.